Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Rock and Roll Idols, and I'm here today with two of my favorite guests, Lou Longobardi and David Bedford. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Ed Sullivan shows. So, welcome, Lou,
Hi, Bob.
and welcome, David.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Lou. Good to be with you.
Hey, David.
So, just to start off a little bit of my recollection of the day, the first Beatles broadcast on Ed Sullivan was a lot of anticipation build up for a couple of weeks, at least for me, waiting for those shows to come around, and that anticipation built as you went through the day. Back then there was no internet. Obviously, the whole family huddled around the black and white TV to watch the event, and it was just fabulous. Very few things that I remember compared to waiting for the Beatles to come on. That anticipation was one thing, but then you had to wait after the first set. We had to wait through probably Topo Gigio, Kate Smith, and the guy spinning the dishes before we got to the final set at the end of the show. So, Lou, is that the way you remember it?
Yeah, well, not quite, but partially true. I actually had very little, if any, anticipation of it because up until that day, I hadn't heard of the Beatles. At least I had heard them, but I didn't know I had heard them about 2 weeks earlier. And I was at my cousin's house, and we were talking in one of the rooms, and in the other room the radio was on, and I remembered my ears picking up the sound of this song coming out, and I remember it being the end of the middle eight of I Want to Hold Your Hand, the I Can't Hide. And I just remember that striking my ears as something like I had never heard of before. But the conversation, we just continued. It just was on, came and went. I was often, we always used to go to the same cousin's house every Saturday night. So we just were doing our ordinary, normal things. So that was on my birthday, which happened to be a Saturday, January 25th, 1964, my 12th birthday. And I recall the week before the Beatles came, I recall the Journal American carrying some kind of a special, like seemed like it was every day, and there were these mop top heads in the Journal American, but I never bothered to read the article. I don't know why. I listened to the radio every morning. I woke up to the radio every morning, WABC, Herb Oscar Anderson. And, I used to wake up, and within 45 minutes, I was washed, dressed and out the door to school. And I suppose during that month of January, I'd love to be able to check, but a Beatles song never came on, at least to where maybe I was in washing up at the time when the Beatles came on, but I never heard any of their songs that I was aware of all of January. So the morning, that day, I wasn't. Nobody in school was talking about it. There was no anticipation. None of my classmates ever brought it up. Um, and that Sunday, I was getting ready to have our normal Sunday dinner at my grandmother's house, with my cousins and aunts and uncles. And one of my older cousins, who I, basically lived with, we lived in the same apartment block. I was on the fourth floor, he was on the first floor. We were, very close, and we saw each other every day, but we never talked about it. He never talked about it. Apparently, he had heard it on the radio. He was in high school. I was in seventh grade. He was in high school. He was driven to school one morning, and he heard about the Beatles on the radio, heard them. So he was aware of it. And he started this, as like an older brother would do. That's the kind of relationship we had, his countdown and in my ear every hour on the hour, 5 more hours, 4 more hours, 3 more. So, that was my anticipation. It was an annoying anticipation, playfully annoying, but it was a kind of an annoying one. Like, what are you talking about? What is this going to be? So, of course, we did gather around. It happened to be another one of the Sundays that we didn't go see my other grandparents, because that was my grandmother. We would often go to my father's mother in the evening, in the late afternoon and evening after dinner. But we didn't do that. We ended up staying. It wasn't every Sunday we did that, but we ended up staying at this my other grandmother's house, and we watched Ed Sullivan whenever we did that. So I happened to watch Ed Sullivan that night with all that that was the anticipation that I experienced. And long story short, again, the obviously when they came on, it struck me as something really good right away. And but it's still I still didn't make the connection until the very end of their last performance when I heard them singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and I heard them get to the middle eight, and I heard the refrain, the "I Can't Hide" refrain, and I still to this day can remember that moment when I immediately went back 2 weeks earlier and said, "Oh, that's what I was hearing back then that I liked." But I had never had enough curiosity within those 2 weeks to find out who that band was and what that song was. So it wasn't really until the end of the Ed Sullivan Show that I made the connection to the music I had heard 2 weeks earlier. So that was um, that was my experience. As far as the waiting in between, I don't recall a lot because we just saw what we saw and then we talked about it. While all the other acts were on, I don't think I even saw those other acts, and we just kind of waited around till they got back on the air, and it was great, and that was it. That was the moment.
So now, so I knew about them because I recall, and I don't remember the date. You guys probably remember better than I do, but I remember seeing them on the Jack Parr show, and he had a little clip of them. I couldn't have been, if it was a minute, it was long, a very quick clip, and he kind of joked about these guys from England and their hair and all of that. So I had known about them, and I remember. I mean, I definitely know I knew the songs before them coming around. But David, I'd like to ask you, since you didn't exist like we did, when did you first know about these Ed Sullivan shows?
For me, and to actually see some footage of it, I remember when I watched Anthology, when that came out as a television series. So I knew of it. It's one of those things to talk about. But you also have to realise that, and this, I always remember when we did the Fest for Beatles fans in New York City on the exact anniversary back in 2014. And we were doing a panel, and there was about half a dozen of us there. And we were doing this panel with a group of Liverpudlians. And I went to a Q&A, and one of them asked us, said, what are you doing back home to celebrate the 50th anniversary? And I cheekily said, well, we had ours 2 years ago. Because for us, Ringo joining and Love Me Do coming out, that was the start. So for us, there wasn't this massive awareness of the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, as we're saying, obviously, I didn't appear until 65. So I was asking some friends of mine who were around at the time, saying, well, was there a buzz in Britain at the time? What coverage was there? Did anybody mention the Ed Sullivan Show or what? And I spoke to a number of people who've all said the same thing. I think it was British Pathing News covered their arrival in New York, and they were also there to cover their return when they got back to London. So that was covered, and so it get a mention in the news story of what had gone on, etc. But the only footage and stuff that was around was for them a bit of the new stuff when they arrived, and the footage when they came back to London. Now, a number of journalists, as we know, British journalists, travelled out there, so it was more in print than anything else. I mean, I don't know how soon after the figure of 73 million viewers was coming out, but as far as the British media was concerned, there was no big thing about the Ed Sullivan Show as such. It would appear in print, but that was it. So for me, it wasn't a massive thing. And of course, my interest, has always been in the Beatles from Liverpool and the local stuff, and what they did in Britain and their albums, etc. So I had very little understanding of how different your albums were over there. But the impact of Ed Sullivan only really properly came to my imagination was when we got the anthology series and that appeared on television. Yeah, we didn't have a video player until probably mid-80s. I was at school. I left school in '83. So big thing for me obviously was John being murdered in 1980, and again I was only 15.
Well, that was when I think we had it on some bootleg records, LPs, the Ed Sullivan appearance, but until we didn't really get to see it again until the mid '80s. So you're talking 20 something years before we really got to see it again. And of course, the bootlegs we were looking at weren't very good quality, until Ed Sullivan put out the good ones. Um, but yeah, the acts that were on afterwards, actually, they were there was a magician who did some card tricks who wasn't bad, really wasn't bad, and if you did stay and watch, Bob, you would have seen a very interesting performance because, uh, first of all, there was a lot of other British acts that were on, and one of the acts that was on was the Broadway musical Oliver, and Georgia Brown was playing the lead, a female role in that, and the Artful Dodger, one of the lead roles in that play, was played by Davy Jones, who became one of the monkeys. And we were fortunate to have those Ed Sullivan shows now in their entirety, and if you watch that, you'll see Davy Jones. I assume it was his TV debut. I mean, he was on stage, but he may have been on TV somewhere else, but certainly in America. And he plays a big role in the next, the number. So Davy Jones of the Monkees was made his debut on American television, I believe, the same night that the Beatles made their debut. So there's a lot of interesting, very interesting twists and turns, to that show, and even the other shows that they did on that first visit. Their second show in Miami, the third show. Um, and if you want to get into that, we certainly can, talk about some of those interesting things. But Tessie O'Shea was another one of the acts that was on that night. And interestingly enough, I just watched it again, in preparation of having this discussion today. Uh, Really great banjo player. I mean, she was from that, the music hall, the British music hall tradition, and I'm surprised that the Beatles never spoke about. Maybe they never did interact with any of the other acts on that show. I think the comedy team of Brill, forget her name, Charlie Brill and Mitzi somebody, Mitzi McCall, Call and Brill and McCall. Anyway, they claim that John and maybe somebody else, one of the other Beatles, came in and talked to them in their dressing room, before the appearances. But they never spoke about any of the other acts. I never heard them comment on the Davy Jones thing. I don't think Davy Jones got to interact with them at all. And Tessie O'Shea, I would have thought that that might have been somebody that they might have actually, spoken to. And with the banjo that she played, that with John, learned to play the banjo, and George, they love the banjo. And I don't know if you've ever seen her, but take a look at it. She played a pretty mean banjo.
She was a big star over here.
Yeah, yeah. So the acts weren't too bad. Then of course they were the acrobats and all of that. So it actually wasn't a bad show. I think of the three shows, it was probably the best show. If you watched all three in their entirety, I think that one is the best show.
Yeah, well, none of his shows were bad. But let me ask you this: there, what brought about Ed Sullivan wanting to have the Beatles on their show? And I also, if I remember correctly, there was kind of a special deal made that they didn't get paid a lot of money to do these shows.
Well, I guess a lot of money. I'll throw some of. I'll start it off and then I'll throw it over to David. But you know, a lot of money. They were paid $10,000 for three shows. $3,500 for the two live shows, and $3,000 for the tape show, and their lodging and travel expenses were paid for.
And I think that's a little bit more than Lorne Michaels offered the Beatles to come back on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, it's a little more than that. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, the way it came about was, as it started in England. I mean, that's really where it happened. And Ed Sullivan, I think the big show was where Beatlemania started, was a show I think was similar to Ed Sullivan, a variety show on Sunday night that was family, the Val Parnell Sunday night at the London Palladium, that they appeared in mid-October. And that was the birth of Beatlemania, in the British press. That's when they coined the term, and that's when they started, talking about it, Beatlemania. And a few weeks after that, Ed Sullivan was traveling, and he was going through Heathrow, and a lot of celebrities and dignitaries were going through Heathrow. Apparently that day, the Prime Minister and somebody else, and but there was a large group of girls there, about, I don't know, 1,500 or something like that. And Ed Sullivan witnessed it, and he said, "What is this crowd all about?" And someone said, "The Beatles." And he said, "What are the Beatles?" And they told him, what it was. And then, through his contacts, of course, CBS, had talent, their British talent counterparts, and Peter Pritchard was one who was a theatrical agent. So there was conversations, about them, and Sullivan was interested in, bringing them onto the show in New York, and he sort of recognized it as possibly another Elvis moment that he might be able to have, and he was right. But that's really what started it. And then in November, there was more. There seemed to be more coverage, that happened. But David, the Val Parnell, the London Palladium. I know that Ringo's parents used to say, they used to joke around, "See you on the Palladium, see you on the Palladium." I guess they were referring to that show. What was that show? What was the significance of that show?
That was the equivalent of Ed Sullivan. Because even when I was a kid and growing up, Sunday night at the London Palladium was still a big show. Then it disappeared, and it's come back again. So there's still um, a Sunday night at the London Palladium. So it was, as you say, amongst Ringo's family, that was the pinnacle. If you could appear on the Palladium show, you had made it, and that was the ultimate. And I mean, some people get a couple of performances mixed up. So you said the Palladium one, 13th of October in '63, and whereas sort of Beatlemania as the mad crowds, um, as we know with our love of the early history, Liverland Town Hall, 27th December 1960, was the first time they'd had a crowd sort of rush to the stage and watch them. But this was the first time, really, in the national gaze. There'd been so much of a buzz, after Please Please Me had gone to number one, and they had the UK tours everywhere. So they were big news coming through '63, which is how they end up um, at the Palladium show. And that, as you rightly say, is after that, this idea of all these girls screaming, the mania would, the term Beatlemania was coined. And then you have the second sort of big show, which was, to make it an entertainment, was the London Palladium. But if you wanted the best thing possible, it's the Royal Seal of Approval, and that was to be on the Royal Variety performance. Um, that is still a regular annual event. That is still the place to go. And so they did that. Was it 4th of November, '63? The Queen herself wasn't there, but the Queen Mother was there, and Princess Margaret, Elizabeth's sister, was there. And of course, that is the famous one where they're finishing up with Twist and Shout, and John had been working out what to say, and does his famous one of those in the cheaper seats can clap, and the rest of you rattle your jewelry. Um, and the anecdotal thing is, supposedly, in the dressing room before, Brian was an absolute nervous wreck, because you know what Lennon was like, and he was threatening to throw the F word into that as well. So that would just have Brian on edge. But I think it's interesting when you see John deliver that. He then does that sort of shouting away and think, I got away with that one. I'm sticking with that. And of course, that just it made the mania even more manic. You know, it was a huge, huge thing. Um, but they never did that show again. They thought once was enough. They never did it again. But they were the two top shows in Britain you could do to get to a mass audience.
Yeah, and ironically, that show, it was the day after that show that so you're now talking about 2 weeks after Ed Sullivan saw them on October 31st, and now you're in well, actually 1 week. It was I think, like you say, the fourth or the seventh, whatever. And right after that, Brian already had a planned trip to come to New York for 2 weeks. Seems odd that he seemed like he didn't have that much to do for 2 weeks, but he planned a 2 week trip. He was in New York for 2 weeks. And he left the day after the Royal Variety Show, left for New York with Billy J. Kramer. And the purpose of the trip was really to promote Billy J. And had meetings with Liberty Records and things like that, and of which not much came of it, unfortunately for Billy J. But it was through his contacts with Pritchard and Walter Hoffer and in the state, in the city, that they sat. That's when he sat down with Sullivan and his son-in-law Bob Precht and negotiated the three shows. And the three shows, as I say, was the one on February 9th, the live one from Miami Beach, which Brian thought that's great. We can go down there and get some R&R, in the sun in February. Wonderful. And then the third show, was taped. And I didn't know for a long time that, and I don't think a lot of people knew, it wasn't really reported, that third show was actually their first appearance in front of an American audience. That the third show was taped during the afternoon of February 9th, and but it aired, you know, two weeks later. But that was really the first. They only did three songs, but it was aired that same day. But interestingly, I go back sometimes and look at some of my source documents. My first ever publication that I ever bought, which was this magazine, which had the picture. I remember buying it on the way home from school, was hanging in the window of the candy store as I passed by, and I went in and got it, whatever it was, 30 for 50 cents, 50 cents. And, but I read in here, it actually said it in here that they taped that third appearance that day. So had I read more closely, I would have known that right from the get go. But it took me many, many years, and I think a lot of people many, many years. It wasn't common knowledge, I don't think, that first show was, the third show was really taped on the afternoon of the 9th. And, so they did two shows. And I'll let David talk about the coincidence of February 9th, the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah, it's one we've had a few conversations over the years. I love finding connections between things. One of the first when I was doing the research on Liverpool, and realizing the Casbah had opened on the 29th of August, I thought, hang on, that sounds familiar. And of course, their last ever performance at Candlestick Park was 29th of August. 7 years between the Quarrymen with four guitars opening the Casbah to the Beatles closing with their last scheduled appearance. But the one, of course, with the 9th is you only have to go back 3 years, and that was the Beatles' debut during a lunchtime at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. And I think because Brian discovered the Beatles at the Cavern, they very cleverly caught on with it. This is the birthplace of the Beatles, and people just assumed that they'd always been there. But of course, it was Mona Best who actually got the Beatles into the Cavern, and that was the 9th of February 61. So exactly 3 years between them debuting at the Cavern. Here they are on Ed Sullivan.
There are a couple. There are a couple of more, but that's a really good one. As far as the dates, first time at the Cavern, and then first time, on American TV, and I mean, other people. I checked with other people in my family, like Bob. Some of them saw them on Jack Parr. Jenny happened to hear them on the radio, but again, and some other cousins of mine that I spent a lot of time with, a lot of Beatle time with, they were all aware of it. I was the only one that was not aware of it. They were all aware of it from school and from listening to the radio. I have no idea. I was a radio listener. I have no idea why I didn't hear it. Uh, it just happened. But they all had a different experience than I did. They were all anticipating it. They were all gathered around the TV. They made sure, yeah, we're going to watch it tonight with their sisters and their brothers and all that. And they I was the only one that was clueless that day. And I don't know. Maybe that was good. Maybe it. I didn't have any preconceived notions, and it just struck me. I remember my family's reaction to it. We had a couple of musicians in the family. One who was a drummer, and I remember. Them, commenting on, Ringo not holding the sticks right, and they'll be around. They'll 2 months from now they'll be gone, and all that kind of stuff. And I remember my grandmother, commenting on in Italian on Ringo's nose. She kept calling him Nazone, Nazone, which in Italian means nose. So they had an impact. I mean, I think everybody enjoyed it. To be honest, I think they all enjoyed it, and that generation. But I think they kind of looked at it like, yeah, it was just another fad. I mean, who knew? And no, but nobody knew that it would last. Everybody figured it would be a few months. But um, as far as the other preparations that happen, or what Brian was here, he signed them. But while he was here, they were doing other concerts, and apparently they did a very striking concert. It must have been in Bournemouth, of all places. Bob, you know Bournemouth well. And they did a concert in Bournemouth, and in the 16th, 17th of November, something like that. And then that started to get picked up by some of the other outlets, and CBS News picked it up. And I think actually the first time it was ever shown on anything on TV here was the Huntley Brinkley report. And someone did a report on that. And that was, if I remember, that was NBC, Channel 4 in New York. And they made mention, of that. It may have been the day after Bournemouth. They had film of it, and then of course, the famous one is CBS was ready to Walter Cronkite, Channel 2 and CBS was ready to do a report on the evening news the night of November 22nd. And in the morning of November 22nd, they did show a clip on the CBS morning show, whatever it was called. Alexander Kendrick, showed a fairly long clip, about 4 minutes. You can catch it on the internet somewhere if you want to see it. And they showed that on the morning of on November 22nd, 63. And of course, several hours later was when the Kennedy assassination occurred. And obviously, everything was preempted that night, and that did not end up being shown on by Walter Cronkite or by anybody. So it did take. That was also the day that "With the Beatles" was released in Britain. The day that Kennedy was assassinated here was the release date of the "With the Beatles" album in England, and so it took until December 10th until Cronkite felt that it was appropriate to show that kind of a clip. And then he showed it in December. So during the months of November, and all of that was, post Val Parnell, post Royal Variety Show, post Bournemouth. Bournemouth was not a special concert, but it happened to be filmed. So I guess they must have had, clips of it. So that's why they showed it. And I think, Jack Parr may have shown some of the same footage. It may have also been from Bournemouth. I'm not really sure. But so yeah, you did have all that drip, drip, drip that was happening here. And they were also covered in the magazines. Newsweek and Time ran articles on them. I, I sort of remember the Life magazine, the picture of them after the Royal Variety Show, standing in front of Princess Margaret, and who I probably thought was the Queen at the time. Who knew? But it was, but it was Princess Margaret.
It's all the same to us, Louis.
Just Jack Parr, Walter Cronkite, Ed Sullivan.
And
Who knows?
it's all the same to us. It's all the same to us.
So
I remember seeing. So there was actually a lot of coverage here. Now, one of the big people that saw a lot and was aware of a lot was Sid Bernstein. Now, Sid Bernstein didn't have anything to do with the Ed Sullivan Show, but he was a promoter, and he claims that he knew about them earlier than it seems he might have, and even in late '62, early '63. But by the end of '63, when he first made contact, with Brian, um, he made contact for them to appear for the two concerts at Carnegie Hall, which were huge. So while especially during that first visit, but those weren't finalized until sometime in January. Apparently, there's some uh, documents that show that the schedule was open. And I must say, this subject matter is covered extensively, accurately, and probably unparalleled in Bruce Spizer's book, "The Beatles Are Coming." The Beatles Are Coming, which uh, if you want to know the story of Ed Sullivan and anything else, look through this and read this. So a lot of the knowledge I have is firsthand from having been there, but a lot of the details and stuff certainly comes from a lot of sources. But that's one very very good one. So I got to give Bruce some props for that one. But yeah, that was Sid Bernstein, and he ended up bringing them, and they filled in the couple, the one day with two concerts at Carnegie Hall, and of course, they went down to D.C. after the Ed Sullivan Show and did their first American concert there on the 11th in the Coliseum in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, the Sullivan Show coming over here and just the publicity about it, it all worked out well. And it was a big bang. I mean, and that was it. I think that was our experience. If I had to put it into two words, I'd say we got the big bang, even though there might have been some small anticipation on some people's parts. It really it hit us all at once. We didn't see it growing. This record and then this record and getting a little better, a little better. That wasn't our experience here. It was, boy, it just all came out all at once.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the way I remember it, Lou. It was just like, wow, where did these guys come from? Because they were so different from what we were hearing. It was completely different style, music. I mean, their look, their even down to the accent. If you just focused in on it, and one thing that I remembered distinctly was um, my mom. Right, she liked the music. She was a little leery about the haircuts, but she liked the music. But I have a music question. A lot of thought goes into set lists. Do either of you know what songs they selected and why on the Ed Sullivan show?
Bob, you keep saying Ed Sullivan. And it's not a bad slip of the tongue because Ed Sullivan and television was so intertwined in the early days of television. So calling him Ed Sullivanism isn't too bad.
I like Milton Berle Vision too.
Um, well, I don't know specifically, Dave. Do you? I mean, I can only I know that they obviously had the last song that they ended for every show was "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And that makes sense because that was the single that was out at the time. So that was the one they were promoting the most. And usually I saw, well, the first show was I saw her standing there, preceded it. They did the first three songs, "All My Lovin'," which just to had just come out on With the Beatles, and of course Meet the Beatles. That was on Meet the Beatles as well. And Till There Was You.
Right. So Lou, I want to stop you there because that's a strange song to pick. And the only reason I could think they may have picked that song was Ed Sullivan had a very, middle-aged audience. And maybe they figured, well, we can appeal to a different group. I'm just guessing here.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that is exactly what they had in mind. I mean, even from their original Decca audition, Brian wanted to show their versatility and that they could do different styles. So that certainly wasn't something that didn't ever cross their mind. It certainly did. And yeah, I mean, they did "Till There Was You," during those sessions. So they were doing that song for a long time.
And they were doing that like at the Royal Command performance. You know, it was a standard one they threw in for that very point, because they knew the audience they were playing to was a broad age range, and there are certain things when you, particularly when you do the Royal Variety, there are certain things you have to do and abide by, which means you can't come on and do blaring rock and roll and stuff. You've got to get the tone just right, and so it was the perfect one to put in there. So it, and again, as you're saying, it shows a variety of their skills, and that I think they knew whoever's watching the television, the influences in the families with the parents, and you've got to get the parents on side to back what the kids are getting excited about. Um, Strategically, a clever move.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I say I think you both hit it right on the head there. I think that's exactly why they probably selected it. I mean, it was on the album. I mean, it was on the recent album Meet the Beatles, and it was something that was in their repertoire. And it always makes me, when we talk about it that way, it always makes me think about, you got to go back and look at the Ruddles and watch the satire of the Royal Variety Show when they sing "A Girl Like You," and Eric Idle, looks up at the Queen when he's talking about "A Girl Like You," and you have to watch the Ruddles satire of the Royal Variety Show. It's great, and think about "Till There Was You," and that certainly solidifies what they were probably trying to do, with that song, and how they were trying to, appeal, make the appeal. But again, it was part of the album. "All My Lovin'" was part of the album. That was part of the album, and then "She Loves You" was that was an older song that they had to do. That came out in August of '63. So for them, we were all hearing it for the first time. So those are the first three songs they did, and then I saw us standing there, and "I Want to Hold Your Hand" was the second part of the show, and that was the single. That was the Capitol single that was out. And interestingly enough, in the first show, they did "Twist and Shout," they did "Please Please Me," and then they came back and did "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And they commented when they returned home. And you talk about when they were covered, the airport interview, very famous interview that they did at the airport when they returned home and talked about the trip. They commented how, yeah, we had to play the old songs. We had to play "Please Please Me," which was a year earlier. For them, there was so much they felt even then they were beyond "Please Please Me." I guess they weren't even playing that in the UK anymore. uh, I'll tell you one song that I don't think, if anybody ever knows them doing it live anywhere, the one song I would have loved to have seen them do live, and I don't think it exists, but if it does, someone let me know, was "It Won't Be Long." I would love to see the Beatles performing "It Won't Be Long" live, not lip synced, but live. But I don't think that exists. But that I wish they would have done that song, on one of the Ed Sullivan shows. I think that was a great song, and that led off with the Beatles. So the same way we had, "I Want to Hold Your Hand" with that heralding, opening couple, riff, uh, with the Beatles started off with, I think, "It Won't Be Long." So, to us, that was buried as, whatever it was, the third song or third or fourth song on Meet the Beatles. But the great song, great song. And, they knew they had to do everything. They never announced, they would announce that certain songs were from their Capitol album, but they never announced that "Please Please Me" and "Twist and Shout," was from their VJ album. And again, that was pointed out very well by Bruce in one of his books. But it's true. They didn't give VJ any credit at all. But Capitol, who obviously was put out a lot of money for their promotion, they certainly deserved to get all that mention. Um, and then there were the Miami shows, where they also did a lot of the songs from the new album "This Boy." They did "This Boy." Um, they did "From Me to You." They did some of the old VJ song, Because the album introducing the Beatles, of course, was also out in America. That came out. They VJ re-released it as soon as they broke it big. So you had the two albums in the U.S. I mean, that's another part of the whole Sullivan scene is we really had Meet the Beatles, but we also had Introducing the Beatles, which was essentially the Please Please Me album. So we had all of those VJ songs out in the month of January as well.
I remember going to Woolworths in College Point every time the next single came out or the next album came out, and I think I don't know, was it 79 cents, 89 cents for a single or something like that? Which, when you think about it, that was that was a lot of money 50 years ago. 79, 80.
Yeah, for a 12-year-old, right? Yeah, sure. That could have been a whole week's allowance. I don't remember. I mean, I remember Mays. I used to buy my 45s in Mays and A&S, Abraham and Strauss, and those were. I still have my picture sleeves, and some of them still have stamped 66 cents. But Meet the Beatles. I bought Meet the Beatles in 1973. Okay, I never bought Meet the Beatles when it first came out. 1973 was because I was like the Beatles themselves. I used to just borrow, or I'd go to my cousin's house and we'd listen to Meet the Beatles there, or we'd listen to Introducing the Beatles there. My cousin had both, and we'd go there every week. So I bought singles. I bought the singles right away, but I didn't buy the album. The first album, I ever bought was the Beatles' second album, and I wasn't even going to buy that. My dad, we happened to be walking through Alexander's in Rego Park, and I was looking at it. My eyes must have been drooling because he said, "Do you have this one?" And yeah, he liked them, but like he said, all the parents were still sort of like, oh, like Jenny's parents. When they watched it that night, he was watching it, but her father said, "No screaming, no screaming, stop the screaming." So there were three girls, the three sisters, but he wouldn't let them scream. They could watch it, but they couldn't scream. But anyway, my father saw me looking at the album, and he said, "Do you have this one yet?" It was the Beatles' second album. I said, "No." So he says, "Okay." He goes, "Get it," and that was $1.88 for the Beatles' second album. So that was really my first album.
Lou, you were born to be an accountant.
I do. I actually must. I must have been because I do remember that. I do remember $1.88, which seems pretty good because I think the albums used to be like 269 or something.
I was going to say probably about 269. I was under $3, but yeah, that's about right.
There's lots of other elements, about it. I know you thought that the connection to the healing of the Kennedy from the Kennedy assassination. That's always been something that's brought up. I think that's, in my opinion, somewhat revisionist. I remember the first time I ever heard that connection was during the Broadway show Beatlemania, which was in 1977 or 8, I think that came out. And I remember them showing a film before the Beatles appeared on stage, in that stage show, and they showed that they somehow you could tell that they were making the link between it, as that this is why we were ready here for healing. And I remember coming out of that show and saying, or at that moment realizing and saying, where did that come from? I have never heard that before. Now, maybe it came with a different age. For a 12-year-old, not no, it wasn't there. I've checked again with a couple of my cousins and Jenny, and the older ones were a little bit more aware of it, but even they said, "No, I don't think that really played any role. I think we were over it, if that's the word to use. We were sort of over it, by then." So I don't buy into that theory. I think the older people that were politically minded and had political feelings, they were probably the college age kids, and they were probably into the folk scene and the Greenwich Village scene and all that. I don't think they were Beatle fans that they may have been affected politically and all that, and may have been aware of the politics and that emotion, but I mean, I recognize it. I'm sure Bob, can attest to it. Recognize it as a historical moment, but I can say there wasn't a lot of emotion in it. A 12-year-old that I felt, the need to heal.
Well, interestingly, I think because it's a question. Obviously I've made a lot of friends over in America now, and the whole Ed Sullivan thing. When I first came across that on my first visit over to America, realizing what the impact that show was, I've always been intrigued about, asking people like, what was the anticipation? When did you first hear about the Beatles? All that kind of stuff. Um, and I've been interested because I've always had a fascination in the JFK assassination and the story and all that kind of stuff. And Alex and we often watch documentaries on it. So I've asked this question to various American friends of mine, and it differs where you're from. See, I've got a very good friend who still lives in Dallas, who was 12 at the time. Now, he said in Dallas, said even as a 12-year-old, that affected him, and he could see the effect on his parents, on other families. So within Dallas itself, and obviously that's all he can speak to, but he said that hung over them for a long time because it wasn't just the president was killed. The president was killed in their city. Said, and that had a big effect. And so for him and his friends, the Ed Sullivan and the Beatles coming did lift a big cloud. So what I found is, depending on where people are from, as to how it's affected them. So I think we can safely say, generically, there is no one answer to that one, because it I think does depend. So I've heard it from both sides, from different people, depending on whereabouts in the States they were from.
But I do, to David's point, I do remember that there was a stigma over Dallas for quite a long time because of that. And the people in Dallas had nothing to do with it, but I do kind of remember for quite some time this kind of Dallas thing, in people's minds, that the president was there and got.
And it's forever associated since that day. People think of Dallas, and a lot of people, the first thing they'll think of would be JFK.
Similar to Liverpool, there were places that you want to become real, places you've read about, places you've seen in history, read about, and you'd like them to be real and become 360, and immerse yourself in it. And that's how I felt with Liverpool. And it was similar. There was a similar feeling with Dallas, to just be there and see that whole surrounding, 360.
Well, this has been fabulous as always, and a lot of great detail about the television shows. So I appreciate it, guys, and we'll have to figure out the next topic.